Have you ever wanted to knit a Colourwork sweater, but were totally intimidated? Maybe you weren't happy with your tension, or you didn't know what colors to put together, or just simply didn't know where to even start. Here's the good news. I'm here to help every step of the way. My name is Jeanette and I am the designer behind Jeanette Knits. And I'll hope you take the plunge into the Colourwork knitting world with me because you're gonna love it. Colourwork is awesome because it opens up so many possibilities. You can create intricate patterns, you can mix and match colors, and so much more. And plus it's so rewarding to watch your projects come to life stitch by stitch. And I hope that by the end of this video you'll be ready to start your own Colourwork sweater, because here's what we'll cover. How to pick the perfect pattern and use Ravelry to search for one, how to choose your size, how to pick suitable yarns and put colors together for success, how to choose the right needles, why swatching matters and how to fake swatching in the round, some Colourwork basics such as attention management and color dominance, and then there will be a lot of tips on construction for top-down sweaters, such as how to best separate sleeves and body, a couple of underarm cast-on methods, why you might want to introduce a side seam here for a seamless design, how to pick up stitches and add a nice neckline finish, and how to knit the sleeves without those pesky armhole holes. If you'd like to give the Colourwork sweater knitting a try, why not knit along with me? I'll be making this sweater that I'm wearing. It's called a Yoke Meditation Series number 5. In fact, it's part of a whole series dedicated to getting lost and meditating over Colourwork yokes. It's inspired by Buddhist mandalas and really shine when you use color changing yarn. But I do suggest that you watch the first few chapters of this video before you make a decision on which pattern to choose. If you are going with this pattern, you can also get the original yarn for your contrast color from my Etsy shop, but because I'm not set up for a lot of physical good retail, you get really few colorways in very limited quantities. Basically what I've got in here. I have added chapter headings in the description so that you can skip things that you already know, and that way get through the video a lot quicker, but I have sprinkled some pro tips here and there throughout the content. So let's get started. So choosing the right kind of pattern for your first Colourwork sweater can be the difference between a disaster and a triumph. So let's go through some criteria if this is your first time on what to look for and find a pattern that will set you up for success. So first of all, it is the yarn weight that I would recommend looking at, and DK is probably the friendliest one for beginning Colourwork, maybe sport. I wouldn't go below that. Fingering can be overwhelming, and then you might never finish the project because sweaters take a long time in fingering weight. Worsted is an option. It's not my favorite for Colourwork because as you know, Colourwork projects are a lot thicker because they use two or more yarns at the same time. So double worsted is a very thick project. Depending on where you live, that could be an option for you. But if you intend to wear it and you don't live in an extremely cold climate, then perhaps worsted weight isn't the best. The biggest struggles beginner Colourwork knitters face are to do with managing tension because you're working with more than one yarn, and that's an additional challenge. So keeping the floats that run across the back short is a very good idea for your first project. So by keeping the floats short, what do I mean? If the pattern has long sections in one color, that means that the other color will be running along the back of it for a long time, producing a long float, and you'll have to learn techniques on how to manage that so your fingers don't get stuck in it. But if you pick a pattern where the color changes are frequent, such as a fairile, very traditional, symmetrical, geometrical patterns, then you should be fine. Next one's the construction. It is probably safe to say when you're focusing on learning a new technique, you want everything else to be easy, and a sweater that's worked from the top down in the round is by far the easiest construction because you don't need to worry about too much shaping, and you can try it on as you go, etc. So that would be my recommended construction. Top down, seamlessly in the round. And then we have to look at how much color work are you wanting to add in your first Colourwork sweater. There are lots of top down in the round yoke Colourwork sweaters that have color work just in the yoke part, and then when you get to separate the sleeves and body, you pretty much work in one color. That's probably a good option if you want to be cautious and just experiment in the yoke. There are lots of pretty ones. We'll get to that in a second. But if you're ambitious, you could go with a Colourwork pattern that is all over Colourwork. It might take you a while to complete, and be careful with that. You might run out of steam. I've attempted a couple all over Colourwork projects, and I really struggle with motivation towards the end, and I look for some relief in the form of lots of plain stockinette. So I would suggest that for your first one, you keep it at a reasonable amount of color work. And then there are some other considerations. It should have a schematic so that you can tell how big it will be, how big the finished project is intended to be, and that it does provide a size that will fit you, of course. And I would also choose a pattern that has a photo of the finished object so that you can at least help yourself imagine what the end result would look like. And if you're doing Ravelry for your pattern searching, it's a great sign that there are many other projects connected to the pattern that you can get some inspiration from in terms of what yarns to use, what colors to combine, and check out some notes on what other people have said about the pattern. Probably go with a designer you trust, but if you haven't tried any designers that offer Colourwork patterns, then this might be a new avenue to explore. Let's take a look at how you could find one on Ravelry. Let's find you a pattern on Ravelry by going to the advanced search, then filtering down all the knitting patterns, and we're focusing on Colourwork that is stranded. And as we're talking about knitting a sweater, let's select all the sweaters. We also said we wanted a round yoke, so that would be good to get rid of anything that isn't a round yoke, and a top down construction, top down. So we have already 3,500 choices. I suppose if this is your first time, you probably want to stick to a pullover and not do steeking just yet, because that can be quite scary. So let's refine this further and select pullovers. That will eliminate some of the patterns, but still there's a lot to choose from. Oh, and I forgot that we also need to pick the right yarn weight for us. You might already have yarn and you know the weight, but here I'm going to select DK or Sport to be the easiest ones. And now we can focus on ones that have photos. There's also a filter for that, I suppose. Has a photo, yes. And it should, well, if you're knitting for adult, pick adult here, or teen maybe. If you're knitting for a baby, then pick baby. And it's important that it's a Ravelry download, because it will be difficult to follow it if you can't get your hands on it. And we also said that it would be good to have a schematic. Has a schematic. So hopefully you can find something from these 146 designs that you like, and remembering to keep the floats on the shorter side as well. I'm going to include the link to this particular search in the video description too. So let's find the right size for you. You can go very scientifically and find the schematic and Also, the pattern should tell you what the size is based on. Typically, it will be based on your full bust measurement. Some patterns could use other reference points, but for a top-down round yoke sweater, the full bust is a typical measurement to take to determine your size. So we simply take a measuring tape, place it around our bust in the fullest area. We don't need to squeeze too tight. I use centimeters, you can use inches, whatever you find more comfortable to work with. And then keep that number in mind. And then look in the pattern. There should be the recommended ease, usually a little bit of positive ease. Unless the garment's really fitted, then it might be 0 or negative ease. And you either need to add the positive ease or subtract the negative ease that's recommended. And you should get your finished, desired finished bust circumference. And then look in the measurement table or the sizing table, which size matches your desired finished object circumference the closest, and that will be your size. If you don't want to bother with the maths, there's an alternative way you can determine the finished, desired finished bust circumference, and that is by taking a sweater that you own and love and you think that's the great fit. Just measure across at the bust area from one side to the other, when it's laying flat, of course, and double that, and that will give you the desired finished bust circumference. And again, you'll have to compare that to all the finished bust circumferences for each size and find the size that has the closest one to yours. Now, the great thing about knitting your own sweater from a pattern is that you don't actually need to use the yarn that was used to make the pattern, or in the sample, or the original yarn, or the recommended yarn. You can substitute quite easily by choosing a yarn that's the same weight, so yarn weight, DK, sport, whatever is the yarn weight, and making sure that the fiber content is somewhat similar. If it's difficult for you to understand the yarn weight, you can also look at roughly how much yarn in meters or yards is per 100 grams and find a yarn that's similar, provided that the fiber content is similar, because some yarns are more heavy, so there will be less of the yarn in yards and meters fitting in 100 grams. But for a merino, the amounts should be roughly the same. At the end of the day, what matters the most is the gauge, and that's why we do the swatch. But finding a yarn weight that is similar is a starting point. Then we can adjust the needle sizes to adjust the gauge and match that of the pattern. For a first time Colourwork project, I would recommend sticking with a woolen yarn that's a little bit sticky and not too smooth and slippery. So 100% wool or a 80% wool with some synthetic could be a good option. I would recommend staying away from 100% linen or 100% plant fiber, because those are usually slippery, slinky, they don't bloom, so they're hard to knit with already to begin with. And if you are trying to learn a new technique and manage multiple strands at the same time, you don't need that distraction. I would also be careful with superwash yarns, because they will stretch when you wash them, and that might distort your color work. So sticking with the real wool or non-superwash wool is really the best recommendation I can give. It is also a good idea to go with 2 or more plies, and that makes a nicer, smoother, rounder yarn. Single plied yarn is not as consistent, and as this is your first big project with Colourwork, you want it to look as neat and tidy as possible to inspire you to continue knitting more stranded Colourwork. And single ply yarns also sometimes have a tendency to twist, which could impact how the garment sits on you afterwards. And likewise, I'd also stay away from tweedy yarns with little bits and slabs of things inside, anything that can distract from the smooth color work that you will be adding into the fabric. And then there's the question of figuring out what colors to use and how to combine the colors. I have a method to the madness in that I simplify my process a lot, and I pick usually a very neutral main color, that is the color of the body and sleeves, and then add something interesting and bright to be the contrast color. And that way I can ensure that the finished object fits reasonably well in my wardrobe and goes with things, and I wear it a lot more. If you want an even more fun experience, you can choose a variegated yarn or a color changing ombre gradient yarn. That will add that much more intrigue to the project, because you just won't know when the color change will happen and how it will play out, and that can add massively to the motivation to get through the colorwork section as quickly as possible. And again, it's important to make sure that if you are picking color changing yarns, that the main color is a solid, so not to take away or distract from the busyness that's already going on with multiple colors plus the colorwork pattern. And also that there is enough contrast throughout the color changing and or variegated skein when compared to the main color. One way to tell if there will be enough contrast between two colors is to take a photo of it and apply the black and white filter on top of that. If you can still see the difference between the two skeins, you've got yourself a great contrast. If, however, they sort of blend together, then your project is not going to come across clearly, and all your hard work doing the stranded knitting will disappear. Bottom line is, pick a solid neutral as your main and your favorite bright or color changing bright as your contrast color, and you're good to go. I've chosen this single ply Latvian country wool with a very rustic feel. I know I said you shouldn't go with single ply, but that's just for your first project. Once you get a few under your belt, you are welcome to venture out and even try mohair or suri alpaca for your next color work. And I can see I can see here already that there are some sections in this yarn where the contrast between my contrast color and main color is going to be very minimal. And because I'm not actually a fan of yellow, I am considering just breaking yarn there, winding the yellow off and rejoining back when I'm onto a darker color. And that way I'll ensure high contrast throughout the project. So let's find the best needles for color work. There are usually 3 types in general to choose from. There's metallic needles, there are wooden needles or bamboo needles, and there are also plastic needles that are a friendlier budget-wise option if you're just starting out. Generally, the metallic needles are preferred by experienced knitters because they feel a lot smoother. The stitches glide along the needle quicker, so you're able to knit faster. But at the same time, they can be slippery, and so it might make it difficult for beginners to manage tension. The wooden needles, however, have a much better grip. They're not as slippery. They're also more lightweight, so if you let go of the needle, gravity is not able to do as much damage as it would on a metallic needle, because that one would just slide right out, whereas the stitches are gripping the wooden needle much better, and it's very, very good for color work, especially if you're just starting out, as you'll see later. But they are, of course, less durable because they break a lot easier. If you sit on them, they'll break, and that's never nice. Whereas if you sit on a metal needle, you'll probably just be hurt, and that is also not nice. But yeah, if you're into speed knitting, then this is probably going to slow you down a little bit because the stitches don't glide as well on the wooden needle.
There are some wooden needles that are really smooth and slippery. It's not the issue that they're not smooth. They're very pleasant to work with. They're just not as smooth as the metallic ones. Now the types of needles. There are straight needles. Those are probably the ones that you've seen all around the world, the first ones. They usually are just a straight needle with something here at the end to stop the stitches from running off. And they are great for knitting flat things, knitting things back and forth, or practicing new techniques. My personal favorites are the circular needles that I have here, metallic or wooden, because you can knit, obviously you can knit things in the round with them, but you can also knit flat things on circular needles, and they're even better for your wrists, because instead of, imagine you're working on a project that's getting quite big, and on a straight needle, all of the stitches, all of the weight of the project would just be on one end, and it would be quite heavy on your wrist. Whereas if you work on circular needles, they always bunch up here in the middle of the cord, so it's always in your lap, and it's there's no strain on your wrists, which is why I love the circular needle for pretty much anything. But it is something to need to get used to, because the cable can get in the way. I've chosen brands like Chiagu and C-Knit, where the cables are really nice and flexible, so they are easy to manage. But if you worked with cables from cheaper needle providers, they get some memory, and they get curly like this, and then they're harder to manage, and they get in the way a lot more, which can be very frustrating if you're just starting out. And last but not least, there's also the so-called DPNs. That's almost like a straight needle, except you can knit on both ends. Both of them are tapered, and these ones are great for knitting in the round small circumferences, like so. You basically split up your work into 4 or however many equal parts, and you distribute the circumference on those 4 needles, and you can work it that way. It's great for sleeves if you're used to it. If you're just starting out, then it might be a little bit tricky to manage that many needles at hand at once, but I recommend wooden ones there as well, because they will stay put and won't be sliding out of your work. So if you are working in the round, you'll probably want the circular needles, and then there's the question of the cable length. And I have the opinion that we should always go for the larger cable, because if you have a cable that's too short, first of all, you'll be restricted to how many stitches you can actually work on it, and then there is a limit. This is probably the shortest cable I could work with, because I like my hands to move like that, and you can see how this can get restrictive if it was any shorter, meaning that I wouldn't be able to move my hands freely. Whereas if you have a long cable, you can just make a loop in your work and make that cable shorter that way while you're working. We'll see later something called the magic loop. And then there's another consideration is the tip length. The needle tips also come in varying lengths. You can have a this one is 5 inches long. You can have needle tips that are 4 inches long. I would recommend sticking with a 4-inch long needle tip. That seems to be the sweet spot for if you need to work on tighter necklines, and you can also do sleeves on it without any issue. The 5-inch long ones can be a little bit tricky when it comes to smaller circumferences, because you can see that there is this 5-inch section that isn't bending anywhere. And of course, you can also choose between fixed circular needles, where the cable is fixed to the needle, or you can have sets of interchangeable circular needles where the needle is separate from the cable, and that way you can change the cable lengths as you move through the project, or change needle sizes as you move through the project. Sometimes you need to use a different size needle for a section. For example, the ribbing usually will be on a tighter, on a smaller needle. So bottom line is that if this is your first Colourwork sweater, I would recommend going for a 4-inch needle tip wooden circular needles, and I would recommend a fixed ones to begin with. Unless you already have an interchangeable set, then you can probably ignore this whole section. But sometimes the joints here, they unscrew and they can catch your stitches. So if you're just starting out, it can get frustrating. You don't see that coming. I'm quite sensitive to it already, and I can see that it's coming, so I strengthen it before it causes too many problems. But yes, and in terms of the cable, the longer the better, especially if you want to try your sweater on as you go. So imagine whatever is your full bust circumference, it should probably be longer than that, because you also want it to pass over your shoulders, and the yokes can get quite large, over 100 centimeters. So 40 to 50 inches is the max cable. Is the cable that you would need at some point, and it is quite a long cable, but if you can only choose one, then I would recommend a 40 to 50 inch one. If you have the option to work with multiple cables, then something in the middle is useful as well, but don't go too short, because that's very restrictive.
And now that I've got my yarn and my needles ready, I wound them up in cakes, I can start swatching. And as I said, swatch is king. It's to confirm that the finished garment will fit you, that you found the right needles. But not only that, it's also great for confirming that the colors you've chosen go well together and they'll look nice. And it's also an opportunity to practice color work. Especially if it's your first sweater, you want to have as much practice as you can before you start the real deal. Depending on how big the repeats are, I recommend doing more than 10 centimeters or 4 inches, just so you could confirm that you are matching the gauge. For me, that will be 2 full chart repeats. For your chosen pattern, it might be more than that, but just approximately figure out how many times you have to repeat it to get more than those 10 centimeters. And when casting on, I also like to add 3 stitches on either side of that, just to have the extra edges to stabilize the swatch. And I will also be doing a few rows of garter stitch, also to stabilize the swatch in the main color before joining the contrast color. You might have to do a little bit of maths to figure out how many stitches you need to cast on. And I would check the first row of the chart and count how many existing stitches there are, so exclude any increases, and also exclude any stitches that are placeholders, sometimes called as no stitch. That means the stitch will be increased later on in consecutive rows, so we don't want to count those, and we don't want to count the increases. We just want to know how many existing stitches there are in a repeat, multiply that by the number of repeats we need to make in our swatch, and that should give you the stitch count to cast on, plus those additional edge stitches if you want to do them too. So this is what my setup swatch looks like. I've cast on twice the number of stitches that are needed for the first row of chart, plus additional 6 stitches, 3 on each of the edges, and I will be purling them on the right side to really denote that that is just the edge. And I've done a couple of rows of garter stitch and a couple of rows of stockinette to set up the swatch and stabilize it. And in this row I'm going to be setting up the color work, so I will start the first row. I'll follow the chart, and it's a good idea if you're starting. So as I said, I'll be purling the first few stitches, and it's a good idea to place stitch markers to denote the start of the pattern repeat. And for my chart, I have 19 stitches in a single repeat. That's a large number, I know, but that's just the way it is for me. For you, it's probably a lot less, depending on which pattern you've picked. And I have to knit 9 in the main color before I join the contrast color and work the first stitch in contrast color. So I will do that now. So I've worked 9 stitches, and this is the first time I need to introduce the contrast color. So I'll simply pick up the contrast strand and knit 1 stitch. As it is in my chart, I only need to knit 1, and then the rest of the 9 in my pattern repeat are worked with the contrast color again. So what I'll do here, I'll simply drop the did I say contrast color? Main color. I'll simply drop the strands of the contrast color, pick up again the main color, and notice that I picked it up over the top of the contrast color. I'll explain later why that's important. And I'll work 9 more stitches to the end of my pattern repeat to place the next marker. But I do not want the float here to be 9 stitches long, because that will be too long. So I'll have to trap it, and I'll show a very simple method. If I take 9 and roughly divide it in half, I'll get 4 and 5, so I can trap after the first 5. And I'll trap it by twisting. So I'll take the contrast color and twist it around the main color, and continue working with the main color till I get to the end of my 9 stitches, and that's what a trapped float looks like. And here I will start a new repeat. It's a good idea to place a marker so we can orientate better. And again, I have to knit 9 in main color. If I do not trap the float again, it'll be a very long one, so I'll trap it again. This time I will twist it in the other direction so my yarns don't get tangled. I'll knit 5 in main color. And after working 5 of the 9 stitches, I will trap my float again by twisting it and continue to the spot where I need to make the next contrast color stitch. And here I am 9 stitches into the next pattern repeat, and I have to pick up the contrast color and knit it in contrast color. This time I'll be picking up the strand from the bottom, so underneath the main color, and working it. And when I return to work with the main color, I'll be picking it up over the top of the contrast color and finishing my pattern repeat. Another thing that you'll notice I kept doing is every time I picked up the strand of contrast color or to trap it or to work it, I exaggeratedly stretched out the stitches that I had already worked, and that is to stretch out the fabric as much as possible, which helps to keep these floats loose, and that is the single most important thing you need to do to avoid the puckering and make your color work look smooth and nice. And a few rows in, if you think my swatch looks crazy, it's because it is, because I am going to share another tip with you. How I'm mimicking working in the round. It's likely that the pattern you chose is to be worked in the round without any purling, so you should measure your gauge doing in the same style. but it's not very practical to make a little tiny in the round swatch because it's hard to measure the gauge. So what we do is we mimic working in the round, and we do that by, once we've finished the row, we simply slide stitches back to the beginning. We take both strands, leaving a very loose loop, and rejoin them here at the start again. And I personally like to knit into the first stitch with both of them, and that way I secure both of them, and then I just drop the one I don't need and continue working with the main color in this case. I've come to the end of my first row of the swatch, and here's another thing I wanted to show you before I continue, is how you can mimic working in the round, because it's likely that the pattern that you've chosen is to be worked in the round, and you'll end up just knitting and you won't need to tackle the horrendous nature of purling color work just yet. So you can do that. If you're using circular needles, you can simply slide all the stitches back to the beginning and rejoin both strands as necessary to the start of the row. So here I'll be working with the main color. I'm simply rejoining it there and carrying on reading the chart from the right to left again and working a right side row. I will be having these big loops at the back of work, and that is fine. It's going to be a little bit tedious to begin with, but at the end you can just cut through them. That will get your swatch flat, and you'll be able to measure gauge as if you had knitted in the round. And here I will have a more frequent color change so I can demonstrate closely what I meant by stretching the stitches. So I have done one stitch in contrast color. I'll drop my contrast color, pick up the main over the top again, and stretch out the stitches I've worked, even though there were just one, and I will do a couple in main color. Next one I need to do in contrast color. I'll drop main color, pick up contrast color from the bottom, stretch out the stitches I've just worked, work my stitch in contrast color, drop it again because I need to continue with main color, pick that up, stretch out the stitches, continue to where I need to work contrast color next. Again, drop that, pick up contrast color, work my stitch, stretch it out, pick up main, stretch the stitches, drop the main, pick up contrast from the bottom. And the reason I'm picking up the contrast color from the bottom and the main color from the top is because of something called color dominance. So whichever strand at the back of the work runs across the bottom, meaning it's closer to where the origin of the stitch is, pops out more because it's being pushed to the front by the yarn that is running at the top there. And it's called the dominant color for that reason. So it should usually be the contrast color that pops. So always pick it up from the bottom. If you want the main color to pop, pick that one up from the bottom. But remember to always be consistent and do not switch which one you pick from the top and which one you pick from the bottom. Otherwise, you'll end up with wonky looking stitches and pattern. That's what my swatch looks like at the moment. I'm not too fussed about the imperfect stitches because I know that's mostly the yarn, and after blocking it will all lay flat and look nice. But yes, there's a lot of crazy loops going on that we'll cut when we're ready to block the swatch. And another quick recommendation is, if this is your first time doing a big color work project, don't try to learn to work with
both yarns in one hand or a yarn in each hand from the get-go. I think you can just focus on practicing this technique by working with one yarn at a time, and when you're happy that you have figured out how to manage the tension that way, then go ahead and investigate how you could improve the speed by eliminating having to drop a strand every time you need to change a color. I think it's perfectly fine to work on your first project with just one yarn at a time.
My swatch is blocked and I'm ready to measure the gauge, but first I'll cut these loops because they're slightly annoying for me. Obviously you shouldn't cut if you are using precious expensive yarn, or you think that you might run out of yarn and you might have to reuse some of the swatch yarn for your actual project. But it's not the case for me, and I'm happy to make sure that the swatch lies really flat before I measure, and it's easier to do if I don't have those loops hanging at the end there. And then we'll grab measuring tape and measure the gauge, and if the gauge matches, then it's all happy days. But if not, we'll have to adjust a needle size and try again. So yeah, I'll find 10 centimeters here. It's easier to count if we face the direction of knitting. We measure the stitch gauge along the row like that. And we measure the row gauge along a column of stitches. So if we get less stitches than we need to fit more stitches in 10 centimeters, then we'll have to pick a smaller needle and vice versa. My general advice for a top-down sweater would be to choose a sturdy cast-on, even if you will need to pick up the stitches to add a neckband later. It is to prevent the neck from stretching out too much. And my go-to is a long tail cast-on. And if you are using a long tail cast-on, I suggest casting it on 2 needles at the same time. It will make it easier to knit the first round, and it will make it easier to pick up stitches later on if necessary. Counting can be a bit of a challenge. It's helpful to add markers like these on one of the needles after every 50 stitches or so, and then when you're done, you just need to pull out that one needle with the markers. A quick tip I can share for joining in the round is I'd like to make a loop just halfway through between the stitches like so, and then pull on the cable until I've got each half of the stitches on both needles, and then I can place them next to each other and double and triple check that nothing is twisted anywhere, because there's nothing worse than discovering you've got a twist in your knitting a few rounds in. So I just make sure that the nice and neat right side of the cast-on is always on the outside. And then another thing, make sure you pick the strand that is attached to the yarn ball, and pulling out the right hand needle, that's where we need to place the beginning of round marker. And then we're ready to knit the first round. So I'd like to knit a few stitches. Before re-establishing the loop again, and that way the beginning of round marker is secured between stitches and not flailing around the cable. And so we're ready to continue knitting in the round. One thing to note about the magic loop is that if it's always kept in the same place, it can cause laddering because of the constant stretching between the stitches. So we need to stop a few stitches before the loop, then pull out the left hand needle, and then slide the stitches back to the start of the left hand needle. And then we pull out the right hand needle to re-establish a new loop in this new place, and that way the loop travels around. It's called a traveling magic loop, and it's never stretching the stitches in the same place. You want to avoid making a loop where there's a stitch marker, because it's quite annoying for it to be sliding around the cable, so leave more stitches there. There's plenty of stitches going around to choose the place that works for you. Chances are that your pattern's already got a specific increase method that you should be using, but if not, here's my favorite. It's a derived one from lifted increases, but twisted to avoid any holes forming. And so there's a left and right leaning version. This one's a right leaning version. So we pick up a stitch from row below with the right hand needle, and we place it on the left hand needle and then knit through the back loop. And a pro tip here is that notice how when I pick up the stitch, I place it on the left hand needle so that the right hand needle tip is behind, and I'm ready to knit through the back loop right there and then.
Next, we're going to do some short rows to shape the neck, to raise the back neck to be a bit higher than the front, to allow for a deeper neckline at the front. And by short rows I mean I will be working back and forth instead of in the round for a little bit, just across these stitches in a half moon shape, which will then increase the length of the fabric here, but not here, and that will result in a higher neck at the back. So I will be using Japanese short rows, but any short row method would work here. If your pattern doesn't have any short rows, then you probably don't need to worry about if you wanted to add short rows. It's much easier to add them before you started the color work if you're still in the stockinette section, because it would distort the chart as you work a lot less rows on one side than on the other. I love Japanese short rows because they, in my opinion, are the easiest to work and also the most seamless. And I have come to the first point where I need to turn work backwards. I will place a bobby pin to trap the yarn, which I will then use later to conceal the gap that would otherwise form. And I will work to the other side of the beginning of round marker, exactly this far away on the other direction, before I then turn again. And here I've come the same distance away from the beginning of round marker on the other side, and I will again trap the yarn before I turn and work back to where I turned the first time. And this time I will be working a little bit beyond that previous turning point. I've reached the turning point, and if I simply continued working without doing anything, there will be a hole in my work, which I don't want. So we're using the trapped yarn here to create an extra stitch, and then I knit that together with the next stitch to work, and that completely conceals that hole that would have formed otherwise. And I have to knit 8 more stitches from the previous turn. The pattern should tell, if the pattern has short row, it should tell you how many more stitches you need to work before the next turn. While it was fairly trivial to close the gap on the right side, on the wrong side it's a little bit more involved. I will create another loop from the trapped yarn, and then I will knit them together as slip, slip, purl through the back loop, and that way this stitch that was on the shorter side will lean over that new loop and it will look really seamless. And again, I'll knit just as many, I purl just as many stitches as I did on the other side before I turn and work back again. In my pattern I have to work 10 short rows, that is 5 turns on each side before I return back to work in the round. But the number of turns and number of short rows will depend on yarn weight and the style of the pattern. And here is what the neckline looks like after we finish the short rows. So you can see the back is much higher than the front. And on the last, after the last short row, after the last turn, we return to work back in the round. So when we worked across the final turn on the right side here, it was trivial to close it again because we could do the same way we did when we were making the turns. But when we are working across the final turn, that was done on the wrong side, but we are approaching it from the shorter side this time. There's a different way to close the gap so that it doesn't look funny. And we do it like so. We slip knitwise the last stitch before the turn, and then we sort of knit through that loop that would form, and we pass that slipped stitch over that loop. You can remove the bobby pin now, and let me just knit a few stitches, and it's concealed. There's not going to be a gap here. I'm ready to start my first round of color work, and I'm in the middle of my pattern repeat, which with the first stitch where I'm to join a contrast color. And what I usually like to do is make a little slip knot and place that on the active needle here, just to secure the yarn in place so that it doesn't move around too much, or the first stitch doesn't become too loose. Obviously, when I work over this in the next round, I need to remember that this is not a real stitch, and I should just simply slip it off, and then there'll be a little knot behind on the wrong side, still keeping the contrast color in place. So that's a neat trick. And another neat trick I like to do is place a little stitch marker after every pattern repeat so that I can easier orientate in my color work. I've got a few stitches here to work. I've finished my first pattern repeat. I'll place a little stitch marker and continue on to the second pattern repeat. Remembering to take the contrast color from the bottom, the main color from the top, and stretch out the stitches on the active needle, on the right hand needle, with every time you either trap yarn or change color. And that way my floats at the back are nice and loose, and I will have no puckering. The best trick to work magic loop on stranded color work that I found is when we get to the loop, we don't work all the way to where the loop was to make sure that this area doesn't always get stretched, that it moves around and around. But also, we just pull this right hand needle and continue working like this, but that means that here it's going to be tricky to keep the tension stretched. So what I like to do is I like to move the loop even further, obviously avoiding it coinciding with where markers are, because then they just are in a free fall all the time. But somewhere here looks like a good idea. And now I'm set up and I can continue working with the stitches here stretched out, and my float tension is maintained even at the magic loops.
So I've done my yoke now. I'm at the place where I should be separating the sleeves and the body, and I have tried it on several times while I've been working on it to just see how it's fitting and if I've made any mistakes, etc. And if you are at the place where the pattern calls for splitting sleeves in the body, but you're not quite ready because you think it's going to be too tight, I'm fairly sure you can work a few more rounds just to extend the yoke and make it deeper before you do the separation. If you happen to have your row gauge a little bit off and the yoke has turned out to be slightly larger than you wanted it, there isn't an easy fix. You might need to take a few rows back and do the split there, provided that you have done all the increases required in the yoke. So I'm pretty sure you can split anywhere after the last increase. Hopefully there's enough room for that. Otherwise your stitch counts will be off and you might have to do some maths to adjust and do those increases after separating to get to your full bust circumference. And separation involves a few simple steps. Firstly, I would advise counting out the stitches that you need for body and for the sleeves and placing little locking stitch markers on the needles so you can knit to the stitch marker without stressing about the count. And once you're at the place of separating the sleeve, you will need to place the sleeve stitches on some sort of a holder. I will be using waste yarn and casting on stitches for the underarm. I will show you a couple of methods to do that depending on what you have at your disposal, whether you're working with one color by this time or you're still working with two strands. Let's take a closer look.
My first separation point is 51 stitches from the beginning of round, so I will count. I love counting in fives, and then that will get me there faster. So that is 10 fives. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 1. Before I separate, I'll double check all my counts as well. And I'll do that with all the other sections, and then I'll come back to you when I worked to the first marker. And here I'm at the point where I need to start putting my sleeve stitches on hold. So I'll get rid of this marker so it will get in my way. And I have also prepared some waste yarn. I recommend using slippery smooth yarn because we will have to pull it out when we pick up the stitches for the sleeve, and so we don't want it to be too sticky and stick together with the existing stitches. And I also advise that it's not too contrasting and it's a neutral color in case there's some fibers get stuck somewhere. It might contrast too much with the existing working yarn. And it's a very simple placing stitches on waste yarn using a tapestry needle and the waste yarn all the way to the other marker that I placed already. Where is it? Over here. And as you can see, I have also some markers that I placed to designate the beginning of the next pattern repeat. I will put those on the same waste yarn as well, because they will come in handy when I work on the sleeves. Obviously this only matters if you are still working color work at this point. It could be that your color work section has already ended and you don't need to worry about any of this, but I love my deep running color work yoke sweaters, so I am keeping the markers. And voila, we are here. I can remove the tapestry needle and maybe tie a little knot here. So I'm confident that my stitches are not going to slip off if I pull on the thread by accident. And I can also have enough of a loop if I wanted to try on as I'm working on the body that my arm will fit through. And here is where I need to cast on stitches for the underarm. I am to cast on a total of 30 stitches, and I can do it in a few ways. So if I was working on a project where at this point I only have one strand of yarn and the color work section had finished, I would use the backwards loop cast on, which is just making little loops like that, all the way until I get the required stitches. But because I still have 2 strands, and if I use the backwards loop cast on, I'd have to keep catching floats with the other strand to have both at hand when I restart working on the existing stitches. So I will use the long tail cast on using the contrast color as my base and the working and the main color over my index finger, as like so. That's my cast on done, and I'm ready to join with the existing stitches and continue working to the next marker to do the same for the other sleeve.
Now that I separated sleeves and body, I wanted to talk about something that I think is quite important and applicable to any sweater that's worked top down in the round. So if you're following my advice and your first colorwork sweater is a seamless in the round pattern, then this could be something that you want to hear. So because it's a seamless design, a seamless pattern, there's no concept of seams. What that can sometimes do is remove the structure, and if you're working with a single ply yarn or overspun yarn, that can twist the whole fabric. The columns of stitches aren't just vertically running down, but sort of slanted, especially if you're using a stitch pattern that has a tendency to lean. So, and it hasn't got that structure, so it's not falling as well as it could be. And what I like to do is add fake seams at the side using purl stitches. And to do that, you just have to find the middle of or the center of the underarm, place a little marker on your needles there, and always purl the first stitch after the marker. And this is what it looks like from both sides. It really does look like a seam, but there's no seaming involved. And what that does is not only improve the structure and provides a break in the pattern, it has also some other benefits for patterns that I make with a deeper running color work that goes beyond the sleeve separation. You can easily add waist shaping, which we'll cover in a second. And it also is super helpful when you come to block your sweater, because you can see where the exact sides should be when you're laying it out and blocking. So there's many benefits of that, and it's so simple to do that I don't see any disadvantages of having the fake seam, of adding it to all my pattern. And as I mentioned, it's one of the advantages. You can implement something that I consider quite flattering to add to round yoke sweaters because of their funky fit, and I personally choose to do that wherever possible. Lately, almost all of my round yoke patterns offer the option to add waist shaping. So that means the yoke isn't too tight around your shoulders and doesn't appear stretched, but at the same time your mid area doesn't need to look like a box. We do that by simply decreasing around the sides, all the way from your fullest bust to your waist. How many stitches to decrease will be individual. It depends on your waist and how much ease you would like to have at your waist. It also depends on the length that you have on your torso. If you don't want to do precise maths, then know that you can get away with around 5 to 9 decrease rounds every 5 to 7 rounds, depending on your yarn weight. And in each decrease round, you decrease 4 stitches at the same time. That is 1 stitch on either side of the side seams, on both sides. Because you can try your sweater on as you work, you can easily see whether you're going down too fast or too slow and adjust as you work it. Now, I like to end my body just above the hip, high hip, so I don't really need to add the stitches back on to accommodate my hip circumference. But obviously, if you want to make a longer sweater, one that reaches down to your hip, you will have to gradually add stitches back on in a similar fashion, just at the sides, but instead of decreases, doing increases until you reach your desired circumference. And chances are that your pattern already has this option, but if not, it's very easy to do if you have the side seams there to orientate.
Here I am next to my side marker, my fake seam, and because I need to do a decrease on each side of the side marker or the fake seam, I've stopped 2 stitches before the marker because it will take 2 stitches to do a decrease. There really are only a couple of decrease methods. That's assuming that you need to produce a knit stitch here. For example, if you're working stockinette or color work. So it's either a slip knit to produce a left leaning decrease, or knit 2 together to produce a right leaning decrease. I hope I've got that right, because my lefts and rights always get mixed up. But there's really no right or wrong. It just depends on the kind of effect you want. So if you do a left leaning decrease here before the side marker, that will make a more seamless, create a more seamless look, because the stitch column that remains sort of eats up the stitch column that disappears on the side here. If you do a right leaning decrease using knit 2 together, then this stitch column next to the side fake seam, or next to the side marker, will remain throughout the length of the decreases, and it will create a more prominent effect or detail. So it really depends on the kind of look you want to go for. I have figured that I will take the more seamless approach and do a left leaning decrease before the side marker. That is slip and knit through the back loop, and you can see this stitch column that remains here eats up that stitch column that we got rid of. And I'm slipping my side marker, and I am purling the side seam. I'm excluding the side fake seam from these decreases, and I'll do the other symmetrically corresponding decrease on the other side after the purled fake seam. And I need to figure out what color I need to do it, because that depends on my chart. You might be working in one color, so you don't have that problem, but it looks like I need to use the main color. So let me get that back, and I am doing a simple knit 2 together, and again symmetrically the stitch column that remains is the one that's closer to the center, and we get rid of the one that was next to the fake side seam. As I said, it doesn't matter as long as you keep it consistent throughout the whole length of the decreases, and you always pick one kind on one side of the marker and the other kind on the other side of the marker.
And another thing that I love to do is, once I've gotten quite far of the body, let's say finished my color work or I ran out of skein of yarn, I like to jump on and now add the collar, because I know how this will all sit. I'm happy with how it fits. I'm not going to be doing any unraveling. Now is a good time for me to add the collar, because that will also change a little bit on how the sweater sits, and that will help you decide how long you want the sweater to be, because if it's pulled up tighter around your neck, obviously that will change how far the sweater goes at your belly. So it just generally makes it easier to decide how long you want to knit it, and it also looks nicer and more finished whenever you are trying it on to look at your creation in the mirror.
Feel free to skip this if you already have a neckband. This is for those who followed the construction that I did, where we add the neckband later in case we want to fix something to do with our neckline. And I need to start at the beginning of round because my cast-on, long-tail cast-on, I had picked such a small, I had such a small tail left, I can't even determine where it is exactly, so let's assume it is here. And I want to pick up one stitch for every cast-on stitch. I like to insert the needle through the actual stitch instead of the cast-on legs. That way each stitch column aligns exactly with the existing stitches, just in the opposite direction. And it makes it easier to count. And once I've gone all the way around, I will place a marker and add my ribbing. I also like to do the sleeve before finishing the body, and the reason for that is because I am knitting it in one piece and the sleeve is a small circumference. You do a lot of twisting and turning, and if you've already completed the body, there's just so much of the project in your lap to keep twisting and turning. Even if you manage to knit a little of the sleeve and you can start turning it back and forth, theoretically for me that never works, because my habit is just to keep turning around and around. So I prefer to do as little of the body as possible before finishing the sleeves. And secondly, it's very nice to just, once you've bound off the ribbing of the body, is you can go ahead and block the sweater and not worry about being on the sleeve island. The pattern will probably tell you how to start the sleeves, and depends on the construction the designer had chosen. You might need to start at the center of the underarm or somewhere else for that matter. But it's likely that it'll at some point it will involve transferring all the stitches that are currently on hold onto needles and picking up stitches along the underarm cast-on. I usually like to start knitting across the live stitches and dealing with the pickup in the second part. So transferring the existing stitches on a needle looks something like this. I'm going to go all the way through and then simply pull out this waste yarn, and that's where it was a good idea to pick something that is smooth and slippery so it doesn't get tangled up here. And once I've joined my yarn here and worked across all of the existing stitches, I'll come back here and show you how I pick up stitches here in the corners to minimize the holes and along the underarm cast-on edge. And here I am at the spot where I need to pick up stitches along the underarm cast-on so I can join the sleeve in the round. But if you've knit a few sweaters top down before, you probably know that usually here, if you start picking up from the first cast-on stitch, you'll end up with a big hole here. And what I suggest you do is you pick up extra stitches here along this side, because this row gets so much stretch while you're working on the body that there's no way around it. Unfortunately, it gets stretched out, and the best solution is to pick up a few extra stitches. In my patterns, I include a suggested one. I pick up and knit through it twisted. I have to help the stitch a little bit, and that way it conceals the hole a little bit better. So I don't think I'm ready to pick up here yet. So I'll pick up another stitch from this column of stitches in the same way. And if your pattern does not include these extra stitches that you pick up to avoid the hole, then you will have to remember to decrease them in the next round to get to the desired stitch count. I think I'm good now. I will pick up one stitch for every cast-on stitch in the same manner as I did for the neckline, going through the middle of the first row of those stitches so that my stitches align perfectly. There seems to be still a little gap, but I think that will close off when I start working the next rounds. One more thing to note, that if you're working with two colors like I am here, I do have to continue trapping the yarn throughout this pickup section, because I will need that other color here to join it and to continue working the chart. But if you're just working with one color, then that's not a problem you need to worry about. Right, and when I will get to here, my center of the underarm, I will be making a fake seam, just like I did for the body, just one for the whole sleeve, with, again, to improve the structure and to help with blocking. And I'll do it in the exact same way by having purl stitch just after the beginning of round marker.
And that's a wrap on our Colourwork sweater adventure. I hope this video has helped you feel more confident and excited to tackle your own project. Remember, like anything in knitting, it's all about practice and enjoying the process. Mistakes are just part of the journey, and every stitch will take you closer to becoming a master. If you have been making a sweater along with me, I'd love to see your progress, so tag me in your social media posts if you share, or drop a comment down below. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me and I'll do my best to point you in the right direction. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.